A lot of what I'm going to say is going to, hopefully not be redundant, but at least reinforcing of all the things that have already been said, but also will be somewhat of a prelude to the work that other people in this group that I'm partially representing here today, Deep Time Chicago, will be talking about in the next session. But to address this question of sort of the first session, which I think is this broader question of the Anthropocene? I'll go with Anthropocene. I also think it's significant for the fact that it frames the planetary situation and the human contributions to it in this historical sense. Now, I'm trained as an evolutionary biologist, so I think I'm probably a bit biased in that way. I've spent a lot of time, I spent 10 years of my PhD thinking about deep time and trying to frame the understanding of transformation and processes sort of in that way. So I think I might not be the most, the most natural person to talk about that framing, but I do think it does something that's so much more significant than, say, terms like environmentalism or sustainability, or the things that basically I was nurtured on through my high school and college years that really were flat and didn't mean anything in particular to me. So in this way, I really have taken, in the last 4 or 5 years, my work has really gravitated towards this term. But how is it not useful? This is an image that, I'm sorry, I don't know who made it, but it appears on our website, Deep Time Chicago, I didn't even choose this image, and it's kind of progressive, it's teleological, it's linear, but it's also spiraling. I love that about it. It's dizzying, and I think for me that captures something about this idea of trying to reorient oneself to this kind of deep time context. I also like it for the fact that in our collaboration in that way, we all make choices that we don't even consult each other about. There's something that's always an effort of conversation. I'm not even sure who chose this image necessarily for our collective, and I think that's actually really interesting. So to the extent, though, that like the particular we in this audience and in our group have a natural affinity for really large concepts and this kind of terminology, I don't believe that a term like the Anthropocene is necessarily meaningful outside an academic context. And I think that's part of what motivated the choice of our collective's name, Deep Time Chicago. It backgrounds the Anthropocene. It's really about deep time. It's about this historical framing, but it's also about the specificity of place. It's not just deep time, it's Deep Time Chicago. And what deep time means in Chicago, the strata upon which the skyscrapers there, for example, are built, are very different than it would be in another place. So there is this question of the universal and the particular that I think is really important and interesting in this whole conversation. Why are we getting involved in the Mississippi Project? Certainly the invitation by the HKV and other groups to do that are important, but you could make a very strong case that Chicago wouldn't exist historically if it weren't for the Mississippi, right? Its location is premised there for its ability to be portage to the Illinois River and to make a link between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's another thing about these questions of specificities. Even though it's about Chicago, we are all inherently about the Mississippi too. And so our group is very taken with the fact that we could engage in this sort of broader question that's both spatial and temporal at the same time. So it's a really overarching term. And I think the thing with the Anthropocene is it isn't experienced in an overarching way, right? Whatever the Anthropocene is, it's this sort of incremental and distributed phenomena that's engaged through small, repeated, and everyday kinds of encounters. We encounter its symptoms, and we engage it through our own habitual lifestyles. And so it's only really activated, and that was one of the terms used in this panel's question. I think it's only really activated when you start talking about like this Superfund site or that drought, right? Or these invasive species. These personal and in-place encounters are the way in which we experience change. And so if we're going to be talking about global or planetary change, I think it always has to start in that sort of very personal and embodied and placid kind of framework. And so in that sense, deep time is about this deep anthropocenic time, but it's also about taking time. So I think some of my colleagues will share slides later, but we do a lot of different things. I don't have the slide here, but we have a series of things called walkabouts, where we invite the public to come on environmental walks around Chicagoland that touch upon things like nuclear power, oil refineries, pet coke, the history of militarism, development, the Great Lakes, that gives us these opportunities to just take and dwell, as the word has been used, dwell in time with each other to just talk about things. And so this walking practice, this place of like actually walking through places we would otherwise go, because in the city you're always going someplace else, right? That's the only reason you travel, is to get some other place. So these walkabouts are an opportunity to dwell in real time, but also dwell in embodied time and dwell hopefully in this kind of deep time. We also have this pamphlet series. Different members of us published different pamphlets on different topics. I thought I'd just share one, since we're talking about time. This is one that I published recently with, it's an interview with Lorraine Daston, who's a historian of science. And one reason for this is to engage this question. She's actually very skeptical about the usefulness of a term like the Anthropocene. But she's the one who writes, has the presumption to write history, right? And so what does time mean to someone who actually has the responsibility of writing human history, and what's its relationship to natural history? So we have these kinds of conversations. We create these kind of documents that we share as booklets, but are documents of these different kinds of encounters. And this is, I think, a pretty interesting interview, and just the way she talks about the different temporalities of the human and the non-human, and how would one write human history in a way that actually made sense now with the non-human in a really serious kind of way. So there's this question of multiplicities of times. So that deep time has various depths, and that multiplicity of times is something I think that we're really interested in our collective as well. This is another zine that I did that came out of actually one of the first Anthropocene campuses at the HKW in Berlin in 2014, where it has some collages I put together. We could talk about why collage is an interesting strategy for the Anthropocene, but that's mainly just stuff that fills in for these interviews, these little micro interviews that I did with different participants there. This was an international lawyer, Alejandro Torres Campuri, who actually works a lot in issues around the representation of small Pacific islands that are going to soon lose their land to things like sea level rise. Asking simple questions like, are we in the Anthropocene? What role do people like you as lawyers play? I'm going to send a message 100 years into the future later today. Is there anything you'd like to say to the people 100 years from now? Just to see what kinds of things people say. And I think the one important thing about this, and Bernd already mentioned this, and one thing I really appreciate about the Anthropocene efforts of groups like the HKW is that these are inherently transdisciplinary kinds of projects, right? An international lawyer, a developmental sociologist, a landscape architect, a musician are all going to be there talking about things that are intractably shared concerns, right? Because they're planetary, they all have their own flavors, but the question is how do we all contribute in positive or negative ways to this thing? How can we collaborate meaningfully? And so these are all part of the actual conversations that I think are really an important part of the kinds of things we want to do. Like, how do you communicate? How do you converse? How do you educate? What kinds of things do people need to physically engage with as objects and object lessons to make sense as traces of this kind of condition that we call the Anthropocene? And so I think it's also multi-generational, and that's important. I also think, of course, this is a question of like, the question, Anthropocene, or is it Anthropocene? Because as much as I do hold that I think it's a very good term in terms of a statement of fact in a geological sense, I think that it's much more interesting as a question and a way to pose a certain kind of question to people. And so, and in a Western discourse, of course, Anthropocene might be very meaningful in a particular way, but is that meaningful in, say, an East Asian discourse in Japan? So in this case, I co-edited this special issue of this thing called Designing Media Ecology, and we kind of asked this question, there's a little conversation between me and a communications professor at the University of Tokyo about like, what is the Anthropocene? Is it going to be meaningful in your context? You're another huge Anthropocenic modernist economy that's been driving all sorts of planetary change, right? For hundreds of years. What does this mean to you? Can it even be meaningful? And I just like some of the things, this is a quote from Professor Sakura here, but he says things like, I can't avoid feeling a little bit embarrassment over hearing about how many people seem to admire the magnificence of the Anthropocene idea. This is prefaced by the fact that he's like, I think this whole notion's already been covered in other ways and with other terminologies. So he then asks, it's quite curious to me. I'd like to discuss it with you if it's just a fresh and catchy phrase or if it really leads us to a new perspective in ecological and philosophical argument. And by a few pages in, we actually do get to this, I think, new understanding. But that's just all to say, posing this as a question, I think, is the really significant gesture, not necessarily posing it as a solution. So that got cut off because of formatting, so I apologize. That's the technosphere, which is part of the Anthropocene where Mac and PC don't collide. But it serves my point, So we could have these uniform standardizations. One thing I want to say before this slide, though. One thing you might have noticed in the two examples of essays I showed you before, interviews, was that on the question of if you could send a message 100 years into the future, would there be any message? And not just these two, but a number of people actually said, I'm sorry. And which I found really deeply disturbing, I think raises a question that's already been really well raised by other panelists, is what kind of imaginary or what kind of condition does something like the Anthropocene do? So to the extent that I think that it is useful in describing a situation, I don't think it's necessarily the best term by which to imagine right, what we should do or what future there is. I think those are connected but two slightly different kinds of concerns. And I think one problem in the future talk, and maybe that was the problem with the way I asked the question of if you had a message 100 years into the future, my question itself is probably part of the problem, is that discussion about the future can really kind of violently displace the issues of the present. And so just to reiterate what's been said, right, these catastrophes are already here, right? It isn't like, the quote I had along those lines was one by Leanne Simpson, the indigenous scholar, who says, it's been the end of the world for somebody all along. And so I think in discussing this idea of the Anthropocene, it's a question of presentism and about dwelling in time, not just imagining the deep time of the future or of the past, but of this place that's the node, right? Inevitably, the present's going to create the future anyway. So I think the real question should be geared to along these questions of the future. So back to that other slide, there is a lot of problems with the term Anthropocene. One is that it's very homogenizing, right? The anthropos, like this presumption of which humans are responsible, the causality. I think this is all pretty well understood. So, whenever I seem to go to any event that's about the Anthropocene, there seems to be some necessity to create a new term. So I thought I'd just do that here now since I had the option. Is it the Plantationocene or the Capitalocene? I'm arguing maybe it's the Mosaicene. Maybe that's the kind of term you'd want to use to think about what to do, not just to think about what's happening. Because whatever world exists, it's all partial. And I think there's that situatedness of placedness is something that's the inevitable condition we live in. So how do you make sense of that? It's going to be a mosaic kind of condition, right? That is different and blurry and partial all along the way, but still might form something in terms of a larger picture. It's a little slide problem. Shoot. This is an area that my field station is actually in Carbondale, Illinois, and Paducah. I'll be collaborating on this with a number of people. That's the confluence here of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Right there where it says Fort Defiance Park is Cairo, Illinois. So you've got Missouri, Illinois, and Kentucky all in one frame. One thing that is interesting in this is this confluence. And I want to just hear a term that I think my collaborator just coined the other day, is this idea of being confluential. And how might these projects, and we don't really know, but how are they going to be confluential, not just influential, not just asymmetric, but sympathetic and both ways. So I think for us, part of doing this kind of Mississippi project is an opportunity not just to engage this question for other people who live in the Mississippi, but to engage that question for ourselves and find entry points, mutual entry points into sort of understanding what the Anthropocene is. So here's another postcard picture of the Mississippi and the Ohio. Right there at the very tip of the confluence, I picked up this stick, which I thought was so nice and poetic because there's the Ohio on the right and the other branch is the Mississippi on the left. Right there at the very confluence was a map of the confluence itself, traveling from who knows where. I don't have any idea where upstream this stick might have come from or how old this tree was or what its conditions were, and it just landed there with that specificity. And the question is how you then untangle that specificity into something more interesting. How do you zoom in and then see all of these other weird patterns that exist within the pattern? You know, all of these eddies that seem to exist in the fluidity of the tree, right? Not just the landscape or the river, but the flowscape, because we know with the river, it's the land and the water that are moving together all the time. So trying to sort of dig into these access points, into this mosaicism, that if you then step back, might give you a more generalized, partial, generalized, holistic view of something that exists on another scale in a very kind of specified way. So speaking of scales, I mean, we're talking about the spatiotemporal scales of the Anthropocene and deep time, but there's also fish scales. And so these are some fish scales, right? We want to shift scales all the time, and a big part of our project, and one that I think Sarah will touch upon, is a project that we're engaging in regards to fish, the pallid sturgeon and the Asian carp and these other carp in the river, not just because it's of deep significance to the economies and the ecologies of people there, but they're also of great interest to us. I mean, actually, the Asian carp is a great concern in Chicago, right? Canada, Michigan, and Wisconsin are suing the state of Illinois to close the sanitary ship canal to stop the possible invasion of the species into the Great Lakes watershed. So there's this upstream and downstream. So there's this placidness. It is true to the extent that there's something radical in the fact that certain things can't be moved, but there are other things that just do move, whether you like them or not, and whether you like it or not. And so the Anthropocene condition is also one of mobility and migration, and also the charged ways we think about these kinds of human and non-human relationships and their migrations. That carp on the left is the German carp, which was actually also an invasive brought by Germans to the Mississippi in the mid-1800s, but now it's called the common carp because it's been naturalized. So now the new invasive immigrant is the Asian carp, and all the things that might imply. And so these entanglements have this relationality in a metaphorical and a linguistic and a deeply sort of embedded kind of way. You know, as an Asian American myself of the first generation, I find these issues, you know, pretty lively and very interesting. And so our project's going to engage these kinds of questions as a media ecology and a mass media kind of thing as well, where we take placidness seriously, we take non-humans beyond the Anthropos seriously in the sort of Mosaicene and try to engage these things both partially and holistically at the same time. So thanks.